Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Chasing Lullabies, where we look into Parsha in a deeper way, asking the questions that allow us to access the Torah text in a deeper and more adult fashion. This week, we are going to be looking at the Torah portion that we just read in Shul over Shabbat, which was Parshas Beshalach, the story of the splitting of the sea. And today I would like to focus in on a rather strange, seemingly unnecessary, but certainly topical midrash. What's that? That is the midrash as follows. And I'll bring up the text of the midrash, which we'll return to later on, just to sort of situate us in what the midrash tells us was happening. And the text I want to share with you is the midrash called Shemos Rabbah, and it reads as follows. And so this is in Shemos Rabbah chapter 21. Okay. First of all, the Midrash Quotes over here, I'm going to have to, I don't think there's a translation, so I'll translate it as we go along. And it quotes from the Torah text. And I just got to sort of kind of situate yourself in that moment of triumph, the culmination and finale of the Exodus, that the Jewish people are walking through these two walls of water, and the children of Israel walked through the sea on dry land. Now, the first thing that the Midrash wants to know is, why does the Torah text say that they walked through amidst the sea on dry land? If you know that it's in the sea, why do you need to know it's on dry land? And if it's on dry land, why do you need to know it's in the midst of the sea? It would have been sufficient to say the children of Israel walked through amidst the sea or on dry land. So it comes to teach you that the reason that the sea didn't split until the water came right up to their nostrils. And afterwards it became dry land for them. And we actually, if anyone was in Shul, I wasn't, but I sent through a sermon to Shul for this week's Shabbat. We didn't want to go to Shul lest anyone felt uncomfortable in that space, even though I'm COVID negative, thank God. But that there's this sort of famous story of Nachshon ben Aminadav, Nachshon the son of Aminadav from the tribe of Judah, who they're all standing on the banks of the sea, and you've got the massed hordes of the Egyptian armies charging down upon them from behind, and in front of them you've got the waves of the crashing sea, and the children of Israel are quite simply caught between a rock and a hard place. They've got nowhere to go, and one says to their neighbor, you go ahead, as in you go into the sea, and the other one says, no, that's all right, I'll follow you, you go first, until Nachshon ben Aminadav, he walks in and he carries on walking deeper and deeper and deeper. And you can sort of imagine the situation that people are saying to him, what are you doing, you foolish man? Well, who do you think you are? All this sort of peer pressure that was put upon him. No one else was willing to take those courageous steps other than him. And finally, when it got to his nostrils, so then the sea split. So the sea is split. Carries on the Medrash, and this is the part I want to focus on. Darash Rabbi Nehorai made a sort of inquired, he expounded. There was a daughter of Israel, an Israelite woman, who was traveling through the sea. She was walking in this miraculous moment with the sea split, and her child was in her hand, and he was crying. The little child was crying. And she stretched out her hand, but no telas tapuach. And she took an apple or a pomegranate from the sea, and she gave it to the crying child to quiet the child down. As it says in the verse, they walked through the depths like in the desert. Just as in the wilderness, in the desert, the children of Israel did not lack anything. All their needs were met. They had the miraculous manna from heaven. They had the quail. They had the water, the well that followed past through them. So this verse in Psalms has compared the depths of the splitting of the sea to the desert. So just as the desert, all their physical needs were cared for, so too in the splitting of the sea, all their physical needs were cared for. Okay, so let's just let's pause there. That is the sort of relatively famous Midrash, which talks about there being fruit trees in the walls of water at the time of the splitting of the sea. That not only was there this miracle, which itself was entirely wonderful, to be able to walk through a sea that was up until then a barrier to their further travel, and now they can carry on walking. But actually, it was like a bit of I don't know, a fruit party, a Tu B'Shvat party. And that's what I thought was appropriate to do today, because today was Tu B'Shvat. Today was the New Year for trees. So they had a fruit party. Actually, I'm looking at Stephen over here. So Stephen's daughter, Dan, is Ezra's key worker in Gun, in nursery in Woodside Park. And Ezra came back and he had seeds and they had fruit. And he was talking about Tu B'Shvat. And it was all very cute and he was very excited. So he spilt the seeds in the car, of course, straight on the way home. First thing he did is he opened up the packet in the car, all over the car seat. But the point is that there's this sort of fruit party during the splitting of the sea, and it's not really certain where the sages pick that piece of information from. Like, isn't it enough that the story is miraculous, splitting of the seeds? They need to have fruit trees. It's almost like, they have like candy bars and and Coke machines and the vending machines in the sides of the waters. That seems to be the extent to which our sages are telling us the miracles of this time. And you kind of wonder, when you come up against such a fantastic midrash, where were the rabbis getting this information from? Now, we began this series of Chasing Lullabies by looking at another midrash, the midrash of Pharaoh's daughter stretching out her arm in order to reach baby Moses. And there it talked about Pharaoh's daughter being like Mr. Fantastic's, with these incredibly stretchy arms that can reach out over the divide. And we learned over there that there was some sort of metaphor, some sort of message that the sages saw in the words, that the word itself of Amma, of maidservant, could also be read as Amma, of forearm. And that hidden within that text was therefore some allusion to the great divide that existed between Egyptian society on the one hand and the slave Israelites on the other. And that Pharaoh's daughter was able to overcome that divide. She was, so to speak, stretched out her hand, and it stretched superhumanly over that barrier that created that division between the two, and she was able to reach out to that baby child and see his shared humanity in preference to seeing their differing cultural affiliations. What did the rabbis see in the story of the splitting of the sea, the story of this finale of the Exodus, that would lead them to suggest that in the finale of the Exodus, not only is there this miraculous splitting of the sea, but there's even fruit trees in the water? And before we dive into some text to look at that, I sort of wonder what this image holds for you when you hear about this idea that they were walking through and there's mummies holding their children and the children are crying, and so they comfort them with fresh plucked fruit from the edges of the waters. What does that image stir up in you? So this is not so much a textual question, it's more a reflective question, just to sort of set the emotional tone for the evening.
For me, it's something you're walking to a very dangerous situation, something very unknown, and yet you find comfort and security surrounding you, and that gives you the strength to carry on.
Okay. So there's something there about being supported and being nurtured in that journey. And it's also making me think of the words that we had at the earlier part of the Exodus story, that they didn't have time to make tzed al derech, to make sort of provisions for the journey. And so that's why they went out with matzah. But every time you're going on a journey, you want to have your sandwich bag with you. And it's like the standard thing to offer comfort. And maybe a Jewish mother shows comfort in a particular way, even way back then, which is a little packed lunch for the journey. And so to speak, there's a little bit of security in having a bit of a packed lunch for this possibly scary journey. And for me, there's something here also. I know that you're my mother talking, who just commented on this one, but there's a certain thing about a mother providing comfort through the medium of food in a scary journey. There's something powerful there. Anyone else sort of some reflections on this? It's quite evocative midrash of fruit trees.
Isn't it aligned to sort of that first point? Isn't there also an element of benevolence? The fact that there is something further being offered to those who are passing through.
So it's added kindness, almost like a glut, a surfeit of kindness that was almost unnecessary, but shows a certain love and benevolence there. Yeah. And Russell, if you take that thought, I'll just come to you second, Barry, but if you take that thought to the next level, why might this be a time that would be important for God to demonstrate that even highest added level of benevolence?
Is it that it's a kind of promise that even I've led you out of Egypt, but I shall provide you with food and sustenance, even in this terrible, the middle of the sea, whatever. It's a kind of miraculous promise.
Yeah, so there's a warmth, there's a holding, there's a nurturing there.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind,
promise. And I think that, again, go on, Barry.
Well, I'm just thinking what a stark contrast this is to their complaints a little later that they were giving cucumbers and radishes and all that stuff in Egypt, and when in the middle of the desert they were given nothing. It's a total contrast. Indeed, they were given stuff in the middle of the sea, indeed.
Yeah. We'll have to talk about the things they complain for. I think we might have even spoken about it once before, but there's something about milk, and there was a time when they didn't want to be nurtured quite so intensely. They wanted a bit of separation, and so that's when they start to complain. But at this point, they are being held in a way that I think Rena is suggesting, in quite a tender way and quite a loving way. So, any other thoughts on this? For me, this see Stephen.
No, I was just going to say, it's obviously taking them a lot of courage. It's a lot of courage to walk into the sea. It's like a sort of not so much a reward as a recognition that they were placing their faith in him to do it in the first place.
Absolutely. And the whole thing of walking out into the desert from a place of relative security, even though they were slaves in Egypt, they knew that where the next meal was going to come from. They had certainty about the place that they would sleep that night. And to walk out into a place of great uncertainty is something that was terrifying. And it's something that is recognized in one of the prophets, where the prophet says, Zacharti la chesed ne'urayich, I remember the kindness of your youth. Lechtech acharai bamidbar, to walk after me into the desert, but Eretz lo zerua, to a land that wasn't sown with fertile seed or planted. You're walking into the desert, and that requires a huge amount of faith. And again, what we're showing is that there's a reciprocity here, that your faith is met with support, that you won't lack anything. And not only will you not lack anything in the desert, you won't even lack anything on the pathway out into the desert and through these miraculous walls of water. Now, when I first learned this, Jonathan, sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking, either we're going to take this literally, that there were actually fruit trees there, or else we're looking for the deeper meaning. Now, if we look for the deeper meaning, maybe something to do that crossing the Red Sea, that's the height of their bad experience. They've got two huge walls of water on either side. They've got the Egyptians coming down behind them. And the message, the deeper meaning maybe is that even the worst circumstances, God's going to give his support, his best support.
Yeah. And I'm going to take that deeper meaning into two different places. The first will be the second will be a textual place, but the first is to really share with you that the first time I came across this midrash was when I used to learn via Skype back in the day that we used Skype rather than Zoom or Teams, and back in the day when it wasn't so popular to do such things, and it was quite I had a rabbi in Baltimore, Rav Moshe Eisman, who I used to learn text with, and he talked about this midrash, and he talked about how there was this almost messianic flavor to the moment. There's this sense that the splitting of the sea holds within it a vision of God and an apprehension of God, a witnessing of God that is almost to the point of messianic. And we see that in another midrash which Rashi quotes on that Torah portion, and he says, even a slave girl at the time of the splitting of the sea saw a vision of God that even Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, who gives us the most wondrous vision of the divine court, so to speak, with the vision of the chariot, which we read on Shavuot, which is an absolutely esoteric and very intense set of texts where there's the four wheels of the chariot and the angels and different types of angels. There are even electric angels. Why electric angels? That uses the same language as the electricity company in Hebrew. So you have these incredibly fiery beings, and it's even a passage of Hebrew text that is so difficult to understand that Art Scroll didn't want to translate it, and they asked my rabbi at the time, Rav Moshe Eisman, he asked him, beforehand if he would be willing to translate it. So I think this is where Art Scroll started to make translations based upon the allegorical meaning rather than on the literal translation, because otherwise it would become problematic. That's certainly something they chose to do for Song of Songs. Otherwise it sounds relatively sensual, to say the least. So in any case, we're being told that even the lowliest of slave girls, meaning who didn't have a high spiritual station in and of their own right, were party to a national vision of God that was the most intense vision of him. And there is something quite protective also about being nurtured within these walls of water, hidden away from the rest of the world. This private vision, this private moment of fruit trees that nourish you, that give you something, and in that sense there's a messianic flavor to it. That so too in the messianic era there will be this time, this moment where God nourishes humanity in a very open way, in a very beautiful way, in an intense way. And I think this is something that most of the comments have been speaking about so far, is that's the image in the Midrash. And that's also possibly why the Midrash talks about it not just being that people pluck fruit from the trees, but it's a mother nurturing her child amidst these walls of water, just as God nourishes his children amidst these walls of water. So that's one way to hold this story, and I want to come back to that way of holding the story towards the end of today. But I still want to come onto a question, which is, what did the rabbis see in the text that would indicate that they should interpret the text in such a way? There should be at least some hint somewhere of fruit trees. Where does the text have a hint of fruit trees such that they have the audacity to make such a claim? So it's very well and good and fine having a deeper message to a midrash, but you also have to have a rationale for the superficial message. You can't forget about the fact that there is something that we're being told quite practical, that there was food being presented to them. There was fruit trees, no less, being presented to them, pomegranates and apples in the splitting of the sea. So where did the rabbis see that? So in order to do that, let's have a look at the verses that immediately precede or the story, and wonder one of our old sort of textual tasks, or our old textual strategies. Where have we heard this before? Or another sort of fancy name for this is intertextuality, comparing one text with another, hearing resonances of one text with another. Let's see if in the story of the Exodus at this point there are any resonances with any other texts. So I'm just going to, we'll go in, we'll read it, then we'll read it stage by stage, and we'll see what we can work out together. So here's the text. We're in Exodus 14, verse, we'll start a little bit higher up. Where are we going to start? Yeah, so let's go over here. Verse 19. So the children of Israel are being chased down by the Egyptians. And the angel of God that was traveling in front of the camp of Israel traveled. And it went behind them. And the pillar of cloud, which was originally in front of the Israelites, leading them on, went and stood behind them. And it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of the Israelites. And there was both cloud and darkness. So for the Egyptians, it seemed to be cloud and darkness, but for the Israelites, it lit up the night. They didn't come close to each other the whole night. So there's this separation, this barrier between the two. Start paying even more attention at this point. So Moses holds out his arm over the sea. And the Lord, or God, causes the sea to move, to go back with a strong easterly wind all night. And turns the sea into dry land, and the waters were split. And the children of Israel walked through the land, through the sea on dry land. And the water was for them a wall, to their right and to their left. And if you're laning it, it would be right, that's the famous tunes that we use when we're laning this part, and it sounds very different. And then you go into the song of the sea itself. But then carries on, the Egyptians run through, and the seas fall apart. Okay, so we know that the rest of the story, but maybe these, just coming back to verse 19 to verse 21 for the moment. Moses holds out his arm over the sea, and the Lord drives back the sea with a strong east wind all the night. This image of water with wind over the top, Where have you heard beforehand this idea of the Lord causing a great wind to blow over the waters all night long? Water and wind. Where else have you heard images of water and wind in the Torah?
Bereshit.
No. Hi, Dan.
No.
Yeah, Noach also, but Dan is right that we start in Bereshit, and we continue through Noach. And if you remember our series on creation on Bereshit, we noticed that the image of waters over water, of wind over water, was something that started in the book of Bereshit with creation, and then that image continued into Noach when there was a second creation. And so we're already hearing that there is some trigger, some sort of leitmotif in the Torah that introduces the beginnings of a creation account with a sort of chaotic scene, a scene of darkness, of water and wind. And so if you wanted to see that in the verses, so we're going to go all the way back into Bereshit, and here we'll be linking together our chasing lullabies from Bereshit all the way to the chasing lullabies for Shemot. So you might fear the Bereshit bara Elohim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. In the beginning of God's creating, He created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was just empty and void, and there was darkness over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God, or literally the wind of God, the wind floated or hovered over the face of the waters. So the first thing over there in Bereshit is that there's a wind and there's a water. Okay, so that's some sort of resonance. Are there any further resonances between the story of the splitting of the sea and the story of Bereshit? Well, let's have a little look further on. What's the next things that we're told in the story of Bereshit? The next thing we're told in the story of Bereshit is in verses 3 and 4. So let's just dive back into Bereshit. Bring in my screen share again, and that is the Ayom Elohim Yihi Or, Vayihi Or, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Vayar Elohim es haor ki tov, and God saw the light and it was good. Vayavdel Elohim bein haor uvein hachoshech, and God created a separation between the light and the darkness. Now, was there any account in the story of the splitting of the sea where there was a separation between light and dark? Where was that? Rena's nodding her head. Where was the set?
The pillar going between the light was over the Israelites leaving Egypt and going into the sea, and the dark was over the Egyptians. And the same thing happened with the plague of darkness as well.
That's right. That's right. So just in the plague of darkness, there was darkness for the Egyptians. There was light for the people of Israel. So too, in the situation in that moment when the cloud shifts from the front of them to the back of them, taking up a place behind them, and it creates a division between the light on the one hand and the dark on the other. There's the darkness for the Egyptians, and there's the light for the Israelites. So that's sort of a connection number 2. Okay, so we found something over there.
Theme of light being life and darkness not being life. I mean, that goes throughout centuries. Light equals life, doesn't it?
And I think for me, there's something also about light being movement and darkness being stasis. So we find that in the plague of darkness, the Egyptians, according to the Midrash, become so sort of trapped by this darkness they can no longer move, whereas the Israelites are able to move, and in that movement they then go into the Egyptians' houses to find out where they keep their gold and their silver, such that in the next plague, in the death of the firstborn, when the Egyptians send them out and the Israelites say, "I'd like you to give me some payment for the years of service," and the Egyptians say, "Oh, I don't know, I don't have that much money," and they say, "Actually, I think you'll find that over there in the secret cabinet in the corner, you've got your gold and silver." So, and then they say, "Oh, it must be some divine intervention." So, okay, they give them their money, but there is something about there being movement in light. There's a lightness of being with light, and there's a darkness. There is something which constricts us and stops us moving. But yes, light and dark also incredibly potent symbols in many traditions, not just in our own. But there is this second comparison between the two, is that there was a light, there's a separation between light and darkness. What's the next thing that happens in the creation story? So we continue to jump back into our creation text, and in verse 6, so we said that the light is called day and the darkness is called night. That was the first day. The next thing that God does in creation, there should be a firmament amongst the waters, and there should be a separation between the waters. So is there any situation in the splitting of the sea where there is a separation between waters and waters, such that there is a space between them? Is there anything there? Yeah, of course there is, because when the waters split, then you've got, now when in creation, the split of the waters is a separation between the heavens, the water of the heavens, and the water of the seas. Here, turn the split round, and you've got a separation between the waters on one side and the waters on the other side. So rather than it being a split in the horizontal plane, it's a split in the vertical plane, but nevertheless there's a split in the waters. And the next thing that happens is that God makes God made the expanse and separate the water which was below and the water which was above, and it was, I don't think so, and it was so. Okay, and he calls the heavens above Shamayim, and that's the second day. Third day, let the waters gather together underneath the heaven in one place, and you'll see the dry land, and it was so. So again, is there anything in the splitting of the sea story where not only did the waters split, but there is also a finding of dry land. Yes, because there's the dry land that the people of Israel walked through on their path through through the sea. And God calls the dry land earth, and he calls the gathering of water seas. And God sees, and it was good. Okay. So that is already a few striking similarities between the account of creation and the account of the splitting of the sea. What was the purpose of creating land? Well, if we think back to the creation story, so there were 3 purposes to creating land. 2 of those was to enable the animals to have somewhere to live upon, and also humanity to have a safe space. And we have that also experienced by the people of Israel, as not only do the humans, come through the dry land that is sitting amongst the walls of water, but their livestock comes through with them. As we talked about in last week's Chasing Lullabies, Moses was quite insistent that not only would the people go out, not only would the women go out, not only would the men, the women, the children, and also our crops down to the last hoof, like every last thing that we own, including our livestock, is going to come through. So far, the creation story and the splitting of the sea story, they match up quite nicely. In the creation story, there's water, there's wind over water. In the sea story, there's wind over water. In the creation story, there's a separation between light and dark. In the splitting of the sea story, there's a separation between light and dark. In the creation story, there is a separation of waters. In the sea story, there's a separation of waters. In the creation story, there's a gathering of waters and to create land, and to reveal land. In the sea story, there's a gathering of waters to create land. In the creation story, land supports animal life. In the sea story, land supports animal life. In the creation story, land supports human life. In the sea story, land supports human life. What's the one missing piece that is found in the creation story is not yet found in the sea story?
Vegetation.
Vegetation. Where's the trees?
It's in Bereshit, isn't it? In the next verse, the one you stopped just before.
That's right. So in Bereshit, the next thing that happens before we get onto animals, livestock, etc., the next thing that the Torah tells us is the next stage of creation is and God says, let the earth sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with a seed in it. And it was so. And that's what happened. The earth brought forth all that vegetation, including the fruit trees. And God saw that it was good. Okay, so that's the part that we're missing. So the rabbis seem to have understood that there were lined up similarities between the sea story on the one hand and the creation story on the other. And the one missing piece that wasn't quite there was the story of the trees, the fruit trees. Where did the fruit trees grow? And so they use the Midrash as a vehicle to fill in that missing part, to say that those connections between the creation story and the sea story are not happenstance, but they are meant to be there, and there's a gap, and we'll fill in that gap with the Midrash. Now, that was the experience for the people of Israel. For the people of Israel, there was this sequential sort of construction of order, of emerging order from chaos. As we went from that sort of initial nothingness of water over sea into something quite developed that they are now able to survive and almost be created anew. And we'll consider the meaning of the links to that creation story in a moment. But there's another nation that has the opposite. It's not the emergence of order, but rather it's a descent into chaos. For who is that? Who is that? That's the Egyptians. That this division between light and darkness, water and water, water and land, standing at the sea, that's all for the children of Israel. But for Egypt, it was another experience. It says in the verse, and the God looked down over the Egyptian camp through a pillar of fire and cloud. We read that verse. And so for the Egyptians, it's not a benevolent pillar of cloud. It's this mixing of fire and cloud. It's almost like light and darkness are all mixed up with no separation at all. That those separations which structure creation are now being undone for the Egyptians. And those two walls of water, that dry land, which were all part of the separation that was beneficial to Israel, become undone for the Egyptians. Creation is undoing itself for the Egyptians. So when the separation of the waters are gone, and therefore there's no separation between water and land anymore, so the verse describes and God threw the Egyptian camp into chaos. And so for the Egyptians, it's the opposite. It's the return to utter chaos. Now we're just going back to water with, so to speak, a wind on top of it, with the Egyptians buried or drowned underneath.
Rabbi, isn't that similar to the 10 plagues as well, though? Like the 10 plagues is the reverse order.
Reverse order that we're going from.
The reverse order of creation.
Speak more to me about that.
Well,
Help me understand.
Like the last thing that Hashem created is children.
Yeah.
And
so
the
that's the last
plague.
That's the final attack. That's the final attack on the order of society. As we go from the basics of water, for example, through to animals, and that sounds like there's another similarity there. And so, but I suppose also, Daniel, what you're showing us is that the plagues were also about throwing the Egyptians into a sense of chaos.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
These plagues weren't only, these plagues weren't only about chaos. 2 weeks ago on Chasing Lullabies, we thought that the reason for the plagues, at least the first 7, was to teach the Egyptians something. Was to teach the Egyptians, that they should know that I am the Lord God, that their polytheistic beliefs are incorrect, but their polytheistic beliefs are incorrect. It's not that there's a God of the rivers and a God over the air and a God over this and a God over that, but rather there is one God who is in charge of all things. And we saw that maybe the plague that was the tipping point for that realization, at least for a moment of clarity, was the plague of hail. That there was the combination of fire encased in ice. You can't have fire and ice coexisting, because the God of fire and the God of ice are two mutually exclusive powers. It must be that there's one power that sits above that is the controller of all. And that's when Pharaoh says, I'm the one who has sinned. Hashem Tzadik, God is the righteous one, Va'aniva Ami HaRasha'im, and I and my people are the wicked ones. But then it descends into something else, because at that point, Pharaoh's stubbornness gets the better of him, as we learned in last week's Chasing Lullabies. So we've already covered the first 3, and we'll sort of bring them all together in this 4th Chasing Lullabies of Exodus. Then Pharaoh's stubbornness gets in the way, and now Pharaoh is no longer able to open his mind to that message, and he stubbornly continues to oppress Yisrael. His ego won't allow him to come down from his position. And so at this point, we have a bi-directional sort of moment, one for the people of Israel and one for Egypt. For Israel, it's creation again. For Egypt, it's creation undone. And I suppose at this point, without sort of laying too much of my own meaning on that, I wonder how that speaks to you based on everything that we said so far. How do you read this account, which is a renewed creation for the people of Israel versus an undone creation for the Egyptians?
Do you mind saying that again, Rabbi? Sorry.
Yes, so it's like, I think what we've kind of come to with our understanding of the splitting of the sea is that there is 2 directions here. There is a scaffolding of creation for the Jewish people from the basic levels of water over wind over water on into the more complex expressions of creation. So there is a new creation for the people of Israel, and there is an undoing of creation for Egypt, that those things which were once divided now collapse upon them. how do we understand what is the communication, what's the deeper message, where you have new creation for Jews or Israelites and undermining undone creation for Egyptians?
He's got no compassion for the Egyptians, whereas, that's it. You didn't believe in me, so you're finished. Whereas my people, the Jews, I'm going to look after. But
I'm not sure
Well,
about. I'm not sure about no compassion. He gave them 10 opportunities, so. I don't know.
but now he's not giving them any. There's no coming back now, is there? There's.
Well, enough's enough.
Isn't it something to do with ends and beginnings? I mean, it was the end of the Egyptians and the beginning of the Jews as a new start in life, as it were. They were coming out of this chaos of slavery and corruption, and the Egyptian wickedness, for want of a better word, and that was destroyed. And the Hebrew people were having a new creation, as it were, for themselves, as it was a recreation, if you like.
It is a recreation. I think that's a powerful moment, that the Jewish people have learned the lesson of the 10 plagues, sort of like Dan's 10 chances. They took the lesson and they used it to scaffold a new belief system, that even though they'd fallen into the depths of assimilation, actually, in the time of Egypt, as our sages say, there was no difference between the Egyptians and the Israelites except for 3 basic things: that lo shanu es malbusham l'shonam, ve'es one second, they didn't change their clothing, then and shmam, and then the only things that they kept were their clothing, their names, and their language. But everything else, they became just as Egyptian as the Egyptians. So they assimilated to the point where they could have also gone the path of the Egyptians and not paid attention to the messages of the plagues. And instead of assimilating, instead of allowing themselves to fall to that final level, they took the learning and they said, there is one true God. And ultimately, when it comes to one true God, so that's the God of creation, that's the creator of all. And so they're given a creation-like experience to match their new belief system, or their renewed belief system, with a renewed creation. Whereas the Egyptians do the opposite. You will stubbornly persist in believing in these polytheistic gods and not in one true creator. If you don't believe in the creator of all, well, the order of creation will now fail for you. So it's like it's a measure for measure. You believe in the creator, creation will sing to you. If you don't believe in the creator, creation will self-destruct for you.
But wasn't that belief fairly short-lived? Or didn't they start complaining almost immediately thereafter?
Jews will be Jews, Russell. Jews will be Jews. And you have been involved in shul politics, so you know better than most. But at least for one happy moment, there was a recognition of this is my God. Zekeli va'anvehu, as they say in the splitting of the sea, this is my God and I will glorify him. Dan.
That's fine for the Jews, but why should the Egyptians have to believe in God? Why is it wrong for them not?
All people have to believe in God. So a fundamental belief, a fundamental requirement, whether you are a Jew or a Gentile, is belief in God. It's the first of the 10 commandments. It's also the first of the Noahide laws. Every human being should believe in the one true creator. It's what Maimonides justifies. If you can hear me okay, it says my internet connection is unstable.
Yes.
Maimonides justifies why there's this mass propagation of Christianity and Islam, is because those are 2 monotheistic religions, and therefore the purpose of spreading 2 theologies which are not our own is at least they hold within them the belief in one God.
But there's no covenant.
That's a fundamental belief that there is a creator. There's a covenant of Noah. The covenant of Noah is the covenant of all humanity, not just not Jews, but all humanity, non-Jews as well.
But the difference is the Jews say, we will do and we will obey. The Egyptians never entered into that covenant, while the other people, the non-Jews, don't enter into these covenants.
That's because they don't need to.
Well, there was a pre-existing covenant that they were possibly abrogating. So if we believe that Noah entered the whole entirety of humanity into a covenant with the covenant of the rainbow, which established certain fundamental requirements of humanity, which is formed in the 7 Noahide laws, and then that's guaranteed with the symbol of the rainbow that God will never destroy us anymore, but it's incumbent upon us to keep those basics of human decency. And one of those is to appreciate that there is a sole driving force of all creation, a sole source called the creator of all, and that was something that Egypt wasn't respecting at that point in their polytheistic tradition. And I suppose I want to just pause for a moment and notice something which is maybe a difference in the way that we normally position the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus, because the book of Genesis is often spoken about as a book of creation, a book of beginnings, a book of family sort of traditions, but it's the book of which isn't so much about history necessarily. It's about national history. It's about first of all creation and then family stories. But there's something about the God of creation which is often pitted against the God of history. So at least the first part of Genesis, the God of creation, versus say stereotypically the book of Exodus, the God of history. I remember like a Rabbi Sachs essay that talked about those two different ways that we relate to God. And the God of history is the one who is sitting within our very lives. And the God of creation is the being that started the whole thing. And this story, which brings the God of creation into history, I think does away with that divide on some level. It tells us that the God of creation is the same God that is intimately concerned with the Israelites and the Egyptians and this and that and the other. It's the same God, and it's the God who he didn't just sort of create the world, stand back and let things happen, but that God of creation was continuing to have a fundamental involvement in people's lives. And with that thought, I want to just bring us finally back to the text of the Midrash itself, because the Midrash had this detail which didn't seem to be necessary if you think about creation replayed. We said that the reason the rabbis saw the fruit trees in the water was because that was the missing part in the similarities between creation story and sea story. The creation story had all these parts, and the sea story had these parts, and the missing part was the fruit trees. But there's one detail that the Midrash tells us that isn't necessary to teach that. What's the detail the Midrash provides for us that wasn't necessary to line them up?
Nature of the fruit.
Pardon?
The nature of the fruit.
Yes, the nature of the fruit, but also something else. Who wanted the fruit?
The picking of the fruit.
Pardon?
The picking of the fruit?
Well, there is a picking of the fruit in the creation story, and they will think about that.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to come on to that. No, but it was the taking of the fruit for the comfort, wasn't it? That's
So Stephen, it's the mother picking. That's right. It's the child. It's the child crying. In the creation story, there is a woman who picks fruit.
Yes. Yeah.
In the Midrash, there is also a woman who picks fruit. In the creation story, the woman picks fruit either for herself or for her husband. The wrong reason. In this story, she's picking fruit maybe for the right reason. So let's think about the reason of the picking of the fruit in the creation story versus the reason the rabbis give in the Midrash for the picking of the fruit in the sea story. When we come to the story of creation, what did God say to Eve and to Adam? He did tell them not to eat from a certain tree, but what else did he tell them?
Yeah, they could do everything else.
Not only they could do anything else, but they should. From all the fruit of the trees in the garden, you shall surely eat. You shall surely eat. God makes it a mitzvah to eat from the garden. He just says, don't eat from one tree. Why not to eat from one tree? So we've spoken about this before, but if there's a gift and you want to recognize the giver, how do you remember the giver and the gift? Well, one way to do that is to ensure that one part of the gift stays connected exclusively to the giver. That way, you'll always remember that this is coming from a source. This is coming from the creator of all. So the creator of all gives the entire world to us, gives all the fruit in the world. Eat everything you want. This is my gift to you. Just don't eat this one fruit, from this one tree of knowledge between good and evil, because that allows you to remember that this is a gift from me. But you should surely eat. It's a mitzvah to eat. Why? What is the mitzvah of eating? We often so focus on the sin of abrogating the gift, the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge between good and evil. We don't think about what was the mitzvah, what was the purpose of God giving us the garden. And so maybe the rabbis in the Midrash are alluding to the purpose of God giving us the fruit in the garden. Why? What's the greatest
life?
God keeping us alive. And not only that, but he keeps us alive because we are his children. And so he gives us the opportunity not only to stay alive ourselves, but also to look after others, to look after the next generation, whether that's our spiritual children, our physical children. That's about continuity. That God gets, there's nothing quite like the nachas of seeing someone you love be nourished, right? I have to tell you, one of my favorite moments of life, I have it fixed in my head, is sitting in the square in Netanya, watching Yiska eat a pink ice cream. I can't tell you how much pleasure that gave me. I can transport myself back to that moment anytime, and there was this intense satisfaction of buying this child this huge ice cream. And that's a very superficial level of thinking about that. But think about the students that you have that then develop and grow into and take the things that you've given to them and they make it their own. Think about the people that you give gifts of love, gifts of advice, gifts of money, gifts of food, gifts of any sort of type, and they take them and you nourish them. That and that seems to be the gift of creation. God gave us a garden. Eat from all of it. You'll give me nachas when you eat, but you'll give me even more nachas when you do what I did to you. Give the gift of giving. I give you the gift of giving, says God. I give you the gift not only of receiving my gift, but of being able to give that gift to others. And so in this recreation moment, when the children of Israel recognize their creator again, and there's a creation again, so rectify the fault that was in the first woman taking from a tree, have another woman taking from a tree, this time not taking the forbidden fruit, but taking the permitted fruit and giving it on, giving the gift of giving to somebody else, and thereby allowing someone else to receive.
Does it not also, because after eating, it's you are commanded essentially to say thank you. So it's also knowing where your stuff is coming from. And it's also, for God, it's good because he loves blessings from Jewish people, dare I say, but also the fact that we are commanded to bench after eating. So by him providing wonders for us to have, we then realize the wonder that's given it and say thanks. I thought.
Well, I think, you're saying that similar to what we were saying, which is, why does God give all the trees to us except for one tree? Is to recognize that the gift is from him. And so too, all blessings are an expression of our, certainly after blessings and previous blessings, all blessings are an expression, at least on some level, of recognizing where that food comes from, where that gift comes from. So yes, it's that same idea. Here I wasn't focusing so much on the gratitude aspect, but the gratitude is that sense of, I know where my gift comes from. And so that child will know that the gift that they received was from their mother who cared about them, just as we know that our gifts come from God who cares about us. So on this day of Tu B'Shvat, this day of the New Year of the Trees, we should appreciate the gifts that we get in our lives, whether those are gifts of fruit and or gifts of other types, and that all those gifts come from sources both human and beyond. thank you for joining me this week on Chasing Away the Lullabies and Chasing Lullabies, and for sharing these thoughts together. Any thoughts, questions, or comments, further questions or comments, please feel free. Otherwise, I will see you, please God, on our next installment next week.
So do you take this Midrash literally?
Well, the Midrash actually goes a little bit further than what you've. I mean, the walls were, there was 12 tunnels, all were frozen. The tribes could see each other through the walls, correct? And the floor was marble, and it grew like vegetation for the flocks, so the flocks could eat as well.
So yeah, the Midrash goes into entirely fantastical and wonderful realms of different ways. It was a 12 tunnels or one big tunnel. Machlokes is a dispute with whether each tribe had its own way through or whether it was one big way for everybody. Do I take it literally? So I'm happy to take it literally, Jonathan, because in as much as it was miraculous for the walls of water to happen, we're already in the realm of the miraculous. What's one more miracle added in? I don't think I need to take it literally. I think that as we sort of were feeling out a rule in the first episode of Chasing Lullabies for Exodus, I'm happy to take the Torah text literally, in the sense that certainly the walls, there was a splitting of the sea, but when the Midrash comes along to add context and flavor, I think that the Midrash is giving us a parallel meaning, a parallel process. So the way that we spoke about it in that first time was to reference playing the piano, that the right hand plays the melody and the left hand plays the harmony. So the right hand is the Torah text, which gives you the basic level of understanding, and the left hand gives you the flavor and the added dimensions underneath. It gives you the harmony. Does the harmony overtake the melody? Does it become the melody? Maybe sometimes you could do that and play in synchrony, and maybe other times it just gives you an added appreciation of what was happening, an added appreciation of the dimensions of communication that were happening. So whether there were physical fruit trees in there or not, I think the concept is there. The concept is that there is this recreation moment where we healthily re-engage with what creation is about, where we healthily re-engage with creation being about nourishing each other, the gifts of giving and the gifts and therefore the ability to receive, just as we rectify what happened in the Garden of Eden. Whether that happened through fruit trees and crying babies or it happened in some other way, I don't really mind.
So there's a related question, therefore. If you don't take the Midrash literally, do you take creation literally?
Okay, so creation you would have to take literally because it is the Torah text, unless you had a reason given down to us through our sages not to take it literally. And Nachmanides does offer that opportunity. He says that the creation account isn't meant to be taken literally, but otherwise we should take the Torah text literally unless guided otherwise. But taking it literally doesn't mean that the guidance that's why you have the written and the oral law. Yeah, the written law and the oral law, because the written law is the conceptual bedrock, but then the oral law is the expansion. And sometimes the oral law tells you that bedrock needs to be read in a different way. So the reason I paused there, Russell, was because, for example, it doesn't have to be just creation. It says in the Torah, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Some people read that literally. Some civilizations read that literally, and they'll cut off the hand of someone who does this or poke out the eye of someone. That's not what we do. We say that means that you should pay the monetary damages to somebody who has, you evaluate how much it would be worth to have a hand and what you would need. So there is, I think, a space for metaphor within the written law, and that's what the oral law helps us to understand and unpack. So I can't give you a clear-cut rule, because there's these two pieces of law, L-A-W, that sit alongside each other, the right hand and the left hand. And sometimes I say the left hand might overtake the right hand, and that and sometimes pianists do cross their hands. Thank you, everyone. It was so lovely to see you. Please God, we'll be out of quarantine soon. Yeah.
Wish Shoshana better.
Yeah, wish her
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you. All be well.